On the evening of June 6, 2007, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, a search team waded through thick brush near Longview Lake on the outskirts of Grandview, Missouri. They had been searching for less than 45 minutes. Then someone stopped walking. Beneath a crude pile of twigs and leaves, partially concealed as though the ground itself had tried to swallow her whole, lay the body of 18-year-old Kelsey Ann Smith. She was naked. A nylon belt was wrapped around her neck. She had been there for 4 days. 4 days. That number would haunt investigators, haunt her family, and ultimately haunt an entire nation. Because Kelsey's phone had been pinging towers within reach of that very location since the night she vanished. A cell phone company had the data, and for 4 agonizing days, they refused to release it. Kelsey Smith had done nothing unusual that Saturday evening. She had simply driven to her local Target store in Overland Park, Kansas, to buy her boyfriend a gift. She was last seen alive on surveillance footage at 7:07 p.m., loading her purchases into her car. What appeared to be an ordinary errand became the final chapter of a young woman's life, and the beginning of a case that would change American law. Kelsey Ann Smith was born on May 3, 1989, in Overland Park, Johnson County, Kansas. A clean, sprawling suburb of Kansas City. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. She was the third of 4 children raised by her parents, Greg and Missy Smith. Greg worked in law enforcement, serving as a police officer with over 16 years of experience. Missy kept the household together with the quiet strength that mothers of large, chaotic, wonderful families tend to possess. Between them, they created a home where laughter was constant, dinner tables were full, and no child ever questioned whether they were loved. From the very beginning, Kelsey was a force. She walked into rooms the way some people walk onto stages, fully present, fully alive, immediately noticed. Friends and family would later describe her as the kind of person who made you feel like the most important person in the world the moment she turned her attention to you. She was outgoing in the truest sense of the word, not merely social, but genuinely curious about people, their stories, their feelings, their dreams. She collected friendships the way others collect photographs, with intention and care. She attended Shawnee Mission West High School, where she threw herself into everything the institution had to offer. She played the clarinet in the school's marching band with a kind of dedication that earned respect from her bandmates and directors alike. She ran track. She performed in theater productions. She painted. She sang in choir. She took writing classes. She was not a girl content to specialize. She wanted to experience it all, and she attacked each pursuit with the same enthusiasm. Her family described a girl who, when told she couldn't do something, would smile, raise an eyebrow, and say 2 words. "Wanna bet?" She had a phrase for everything that told you exactly who she was. One of the most endearing things people remembered about Kelsey was her fierce sense of fairness within her family. If someone gave Kelsey a gift or a treat, she would not accept it unless her siblings received the same. It was not a performance of generosity. It was simply how she was wired. She had grown up knowing that love was not a finite resource, and she saw no reason to hoard it. Those who knew her said this quality extended beyond her household. Kelsey was the kind of friend who showed up with balloons on your birthday, who remembered what you told her in passing weeks earlier, who stayed when everyone else had already left. She graduated from Shawnee Mission West on May 24, 2007, just 9 days before her death. Ahead of her lay a future she had spent years planning. She had been accepted to Kansas State University, where she intended to join the marching band and study veterinary medicine. As a child, she had wanted to become a doctor, but somewhere along the way, she had shifted her ambition toward animals. Creatures who couldn't advocate for themselves, who needed a human voice to speak for them. That, too, said everything about who Kelsey Smith was. At the time of her disappearance, Kelsey was working part-time at a nearby AMC movie theater, saving money for college. She was also in the early, golden months of a relationship with a young man named John Beersmith. John was not a stranger to the Smith family. He had been welcomed into their home for dinners and games, and he and Kelsey's father, Greg, had developed a genuine rapport over their shared love of sports. Everyone who knew the couple agreed. John adored Kelsey. He loved her intelligence, her warmth, her relentless enthusiasm for being alive. Their relationship had been growing for 6 months, and on June 2nd, 2007, Kelsey wanted to mark the occasion with a small gift, a scrapbook, something thoughtful and personal, the kind of gesture entirely consistent with who she was. That afternoon had been a good one. Kelsey's mother, Missy, had attended a friend's wedding. Kelsey, her father, Greg, and her sister, Lindsay, had spent the earlier part of the evening at a nearby amusement park. It was the kind of ordinary, happy summer evening that becomes unbearably significant in retrospect. The last photograph in an album. The last line of a letter. When Kelsey mentioned that she wanted to make a quick trip to Target before John came to pick her up for their date, nobody thought anything of it. She knew the route. It was still daylight. She had done it dozens of times before. She asked her sister Lindsay to come along. Lindsay was busy.
So Kelsey took Lindsay's 1987 Buick Regal, backed out of the driveway at approximately 6:30 p.m. and drove toward the Target on 97th and Quivira Road, just behind Oak Park Mall. She had 1 hour before John was set to arrive. She had no reason to hurry. She had no reason to be afraid. This was Overland Park, Kansas, a suburb so safe and familiar that it almost defied the concept of danger. What no one knew, what Kelsey could not possibly have known, was that she was being watched before she even turned off the engine. Edwin Roy Hall, known to friends and family by his middle name, Jack, was 26 years old in the summer of 2007. He lived in Olathe, Kansas, a town neighboring Overland Park, with his wife and their 4-year-old son. On the surface, he appeared to be a young husband and father, navigating the ordinary pressures of family life. He was average in build, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man whose face you would struggle to recall an hour after meeting him. Nothing about Edwin Hall announced itself. That invisibility, it would later become clear, was something he had learned to use. His childhood had been marked by instability. Hall had spent time in foster care before being adopted, but the transition was not smooth. At the age of 15, he had attempted to injure his adoptive sister with a bread knife, a moment that should have served as a significant warning about the violence simmering beneath his surface. Later, he was charged with assault after striking a child in the head with a baseball bat. He was old enough at both junctures to understand that what he was doing was wrong. Yet the pattern continued. As an adult, he had managed to avoid formal convictions, but the thread of volatility and aggression that had defined his adolescence had not disappeared. It had simply gone underground. On the evening of June 2nd, 2007, Edwin Hall drove his 1970s-era Chevrolet pickup truck to the Target on 97th and Quivira. Investigators would later piece together the precise sequence of events from surveillance footage and Hall's own subsequent confession. He arrived in the parking lot at approximately 6 p.m., just minutes before Kelsey Smith pulled in beside him. What happened next was not spontaneous. It was predatory. It was calculated. And it unfolded in front of 40 cameras inside a busy retail store, while nobody noticed a thing. Kelsey parked her sister's Buick Regal directly beside Hall's truck and walked into the store. Seconds later, Hall followed. Inside Target, he trailed her at a careful distance, close enough to observe her movements, far enough not to draw attention. He watched her browse the aisles. He watched her select items. He watched her move toward the checkout counter. When Kelsey called her mother from inside the store, a brief, casual conversation about gift boxes, Hall was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting, calculating. At no point did Kelsey glance over her shoulder. At no point did she sense that she was being hunted. When Kelsey moved toward the exit, Hall moved faster. He slipped out of the store ahead of her, walked to his truck, and retrieved a gun. Then he positioned himself and waited. From the time Kelsey reached her car to the moment she was forced into it, surveillance footage would later show that only 16 seconds elapsed. 16 seconds. It is almost impossible to process. The difference between a normal evening and the end of a young woman's life measured in less than a third of a minute. The parking lot footage, reviewed frame by investigators, told the story that the naked eye would have missed entirely. At normal playback speed, it appeared that Kelsey was simply getting into her car. Slowed down, the footage revealed a flash of movement from the left side. A figure in a white shirt and dark shorts, rushing toward her from behind as she reached for her door. What looked initially like Kelsey bending to enter the vehicle was in fact Kelsey being struck and forced inside.
Edwin Hall climbed into the driver's seat, took control of the car, and drove out of the parking lot. He took her 20 miles east, across the state line and into Missouri, to a heavily wooded area near Longview Lake. What he did to her there defies description in any language that respects her dignity. He sexually assaulted her. He strangled her with her own nylon belt, and then, as though nothing had occurred, as though the entire episode had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his evening, he drove Kelsey's car back across the state line, abandoned it in the dimly lit Macy's parking lot at Oak Park Mall, and walked back to his own truck, which remained parked at Target. He drove home to his wife and his 4-year-old son. He did not call anyone. He did not turn himself in. He began planning a family vacation. This moment, the casual walk back to his truck, the drive home, the vacation planning, mark the coldest truth of this case. Edwin Hall did not experience remorse. He experienced relief that he had not been caught. And for 4 days, as Kelsey's family tore the city apart looking for their daughter, as her mother and father plastered missing person posters on every surface they could find, Hall carried on. He was not a man in crisis. He was a man waiting to put 7:30 p.m. on June 2nd. Kelsey had not returned home. John Beersmith arrived at the Smith household, expecting to pick her up for their date. Kelsey was not there. Her father, Greg, called her phone repeatedly. No answer. For anyone who knew Kelsey Smith, the silence was immediately wrong. She always answered her phone. Always. She had just spoken to her mother from inside the store. The absence of her voice, where there should have been easy laughter and reassurance, was not merely unusual. It was alarming. Greg Smith, a veteran police officer with 16 years of experience, did not waste time convincing himself everything was fine. He called fellow officers. He checked for accident reports. He reached out to Kelsey's friends. Nobody had seen her. He and Kelsey's sister drove through the neighborhood, checking parking lots, scanning the darkness for Lindsay's Buick Regal. They eventually found it. Not at Target where Kelsey had last been seen, but across the street in a dimly lit section of the Macy's parking lot at Oak Park Mall. The car was locked. Kelsey was not inside. Police were called immediately. Officers who arrived at the scene processed the vehicle with careful attention. Inside, they found Kelsey's purse, her wallet, her keys, and the gift she had purchased for John. Everything she owned. Everything she had carried with her, left behind as though she had simply evaporated. There were no signs of a struggle inside the car. No shattered glass, no blood, no torn fabric. What the officers did find, however, was a single handprint on the driver's side seatbelt. It did not belong to Kelsey or to any member of her family. Someone else had been in that car. The following morning, investigators obtained surveillance footage from 40 cameras inside the Target store and from the parking lot cameras outside. They watched Kelsey enter, browse, check out, and exit. Nothing alarming. Nobody approached her. She appeared calm and unhurried. But when they reviewed the parking lot footage frame by frame, when they slowed the footage to a crawl and examined those 16 crucial seconds, the abduction became visible. A figure in a white shirt and dark shorts rushed at Kelsey from behind as she reached for her car door. The footage was grainy, but the intent was unmistakable. Going back through the interior store footage with this new context, investigators made a second disturbing discovery. The same man in the white shirt and dark shorts had been following Kelsey through virtually every aisle of the store. He had never spoken to her,
He had never stood close enough to make her uncomfortable. He had been precise in his surveillance, deliberate, practiced, invisible to the untrained eye.
Retired Detective Candace Bridges later reflected that watching the footage was like watching a National Geographic documentary. A predator circling prey that had no idea it was being stalked. Meanwhile, Greg and Missy Smith were doing what parents in the deepest grip of terror do. They refused to stop moving. They created missing person flyers and distributed them across Overland Park. Neighbors, friends, and community members joined the search. The city came together with the kind of collective urgency that only emerges when a young, beloved person vanishes from a place that is supposed to be safe. The parking lot of a Target in broad suburban Kansas is not supposed to be a place of danger. The fact that it had been felt like a violation of the natural order, as though the floor of ordinary life had cracked open. The police released still images from the surveillance footage to the media. They showed the suspect, the white shirt, the dark shorts, the Chevrolet pickup truck that had entered the lot minutes before Kelsey arrived and departed just minutes after she was taken. Tips began pouring in. One of them, delivered by a woman who recognized her own neighbor, would break the case wide open. But there was another avenue that should have accelerated the investigation dramatically, and instead became one of its most painful failures. Kelsey carried a cell phone on the Verizon wireless network. From the moment she vanished, her family understood that phone could tell them where she was. Greg Smith, a law enforcement professional, contacted Verizon directly. He asked them to ping Kelsey's phone, to trace the last known location of its signal, to tell him where his daughter was. Verizon refused. Under the privacy regulations governing cell phone data at the time, service providers would only release location information at the request of the account subscriber or pursuant to a court order. Obtaining a court order takes time. Time that, in a missing persons investigation, can mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery. Verizon's representatives reportedly told the Smith family they had not used the correct legal terminology to request the data. Greg Smith, a seasoned officer, asked the question in the plainest possible language. Where is this phone? The answer was still no. For 4 days, that answer remained no. It was not until June 6th, 4 days after Kelsey vanished, that Verizon finally provided investigators with the cell site location information they had been requesting since the night of June 2nd. The data identified the last 3 towers Kelsey's phone had pinged before going silent. Those towers formed a triangulated search zone on the Missouri side of the state line. A Verizon technician directed investigators to begin searching 1.1 miles north of one specific tower. The area in question was a wooded stretch of land near Longview Lake in Grandview, Missouri, approximately 18 to 20 miles from the Target parking lot where Kelsey had been taken. Search teams entered the woods at midday on June 6th. They had the data. They had a narrowed search zone. They moved through the brush with the kind of focused urgency that comes from knowing you are close to something that will change everything. At approximately 1:30 p.m., one of those searchers stopped. Beneath a rough pile of twigs and leaves, arranged with the careless haste of someone trying to conceal rather than bury, the body of Kelsey Ann Smith was found. She was unclothed. Her own nylon belt was wrapped around her neck. She had been there since the night of June 2nd, the same night she had left home to buy a gift for her boyfriend. The search had taken 45 minutes from the moment investigators entered the woods. 45 minutes, once they had the data. 4 days had passed before they were given it. The medical examiner's subsequent autopsy confirmed what the circumstances already strongly suggested. Kelsey had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The cause of death was asphyxiation. She had been killed on the evening of June 2nd, likely within hours of her abduction. She was not alive during those 4 days. But no one could have known that without the data that Verizon had withheld. Investigators were required to notify Greg and Missy Smith that their daughter had been found. The words no parent should ever have to receive were delivered on the afternoon of June 6. Those who witnessed the family's reaction in the hours and days that followed
described people who were shattered in a way that language struggles to accommodate. Kelsey's sister Lindsay, who had been too busy to accompany her on that final trip to Target,
would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of her life. A weight she had no moral reason to bear, but that grief has a cruel habit of assigning regardless. The community of Overland Park mourned with them. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had joined the search, all of them felt the specific grief that comes from hoping hard for a different outcome and not receiving it. What had begun as a missing persons case had confirmed what Greg Smith had feared from the first silent hour of June 2nd. This was not a young woman who had chosen not to come home. This was a young woman who had been taken. On the same afternoon that Kelsey's body was found, investigators were simultaneously closing in on her killer. The public release of the Target surveillance images had generated hundreds of tips. One caller identified the man in the white shirt and dark shorts as her own neighbor, a 26-year-old named Edwin Roy Hall, who drove a Chevrolet pickup truck matching the vehicle captured on camera. When officers ran the name and cross-referenced the description, they were confident they had the right man. They moved quickly. On the evening of June 6, 2007, police arrived at Edwin Hall's residence in Olathe, Kansas. His vehicle was packed with luggage. His family was preparing to leave for a vacation. Officers did not give Hall the opportunity to take another step. He was arrested on the spot and taken into custody. His family stood in stunned silence as the vacation they had been anticipating became something else entirely. In the initial interrogation, Hall denied any knowledge of Kelsey Smith. He denied ever seeing her.
When investigators showed him the surveillance footage from inside the Target, he acknowledged being in the store, but claimed he had never noticed the young woman he had spent an entire shopping trip following, aisle by aisle.
Then investigators told him they had his fingerprints. The unidentified handprint found on the driver's side seatbelt of Kelsey's car matched Edwin Hall's fingerprints exactly. His denial collapsed. During the interrogation, Hall made a comment that sent a chill through the investigators in the room. When pressed about noticing Kelsey in the store, he admitted that he had seen her. What he said next was remembered by Detective Miller as one of the most disturbing moments of the entire investigation. Hall said that he had been attracted to Kelsey's legs. That was what had driven him to follow her.
My skin started crawling, Miller later told producers of the documentary program covering the case. The casualness with which Hall described what preceded the abduction and murder of a young woman was its own form of confession. Facing physical evidence, fingerprint matching, and the prospect of the death penalty, Edwin Hall eventually agreed to cooperate fully. He told investigators the complete account of what had happened on the evening of June 2nd. He had spotted Kelsey driving into the Target parking lot moments after he arrived, and made a decision. The kind of decision that reveals the full architecture of a predator's mind. To follow her, and determine whether she was meeting anyone. When he confirmed she was alone, he retrieved his gun and waited for the moment of her greatest vulnerability. He drove her across the state line.
He assaulted her. He killed her to prevent her from reporting him. And then he drove home.
Hall was formally charged with premeditated first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. His bond was set at $5 million. Because the abduction had occurred in Kansas and the murder had been committed in Missouri, there were complex jurisdictional discussions about where the trial should be held. Prosecutors from Kansas ultimately moved forward with the case. On July 23, 2008, what had been scheduled as a change of venue hearing became something far more significant. Edwin Roy Hall stood before the court and pleaded guilty to all 4 charges against him. The courtroom was filled. Kelsey's parents, family members, friends, and reporters who had covered the case from its earliest hours all came to witness the moment.
The hearing was broadcast live on all 4 of Kansas City's major television network affiliates. Hall accepted the plea agreement rather than face a potential death sentence. On September 16, 2008, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He wept as the sentence was delivered. He apologized to Kelsey's family. Greg and Missy Smith sat in that courtroom and heard his apology. They had spent more than a year living inside a grief that most people cannot comprehend. Their response, documented in their victim impact statement, was measured not by rage toward Hall, though that would have been entirely understandable, but by something more quietly devastating. They said that if they felt sympathy for anyone in that room, it was for Hall's 4-year-old son,
An innocent child who had no understanding of what his father had done, who would now grow up without a father, just as Hall himself had grown up without the stable family he had been denied. The Smiths refused to let their grief narrow their humanity. It was, perhaps, the most remarkable thing about them. Edwin Roy Hall is currently incarcerated at the Lansing Correctional Facility in Lansing, Kansas. He will not be released. He will die inside those walls. He will never again walk into a parking lot, sit in a truck, or follow someone through a store. For Kelsey Smith, that accountability came too late. For everyone who might have become his next victim, it came just in time. The case of Kelsey Ann Smith is, at its core, about more than a single act of violence.
It is about the systems that surrounded that act, the technology that could have helped, the laws that prevented it from doing so, and the family that refused to let their daughter's death be the last word. Kelsey was already gone by the time her family began asking Verizon for help. Her father, who knew this intuitively, even if he could not yet confirm it, was right from the beginning. Something was wrong, and every minute mattered. The 4 days Verizon spent citing privacy regulations, while a dead girl lay under a pile of branches in a Missouri forest, represent a failure of law, not a failure of technology. The information existed, the tools existed. The will to use them, absent a formal court order, did not. Greg and Missy Smith spent the years after Kelsey's death fighting to make sure that no other family would face that same wall of bureaucratic silence during the worst hours of their lives. The Kelsey Smith Act, first passed in Kansas in 2009, required telecommunications companies to provide law enforcement with cell phone location data in emergency situations without the delay of a court order. The law has since been used to save lives. A stolen car in Lenexa, Kansas in 2015 was located using the law, rescuing a 5-month-old infant who had been inside the vehicle when it was taken. In February 2021, Congress passed the federal Kelsey Smith Act, extending that requirement nationwide. Kelsey Smith would have turned 36 this year. She would likely have been a veterinarian by now, working in the way she always believed in, giving a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. She would have been the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who showed up when you needed her, who made a room feel warmer by walking into it. Her name is attached to a law. Her memory is held by everyone who knew her. And in the quiet suburban streets of Overland Park, Kansas, she is not forgotten. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We post deep dive crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.